The summer of 1914 was the most beautiful in living memory. The sun was brighter, the harvest was richer. In London, Paris, and Berlin, people filled the parks, talking about the future. The world was at the peak of civilization, technology, and art. But nobody knew that the sun was about to set. Nobody guessed that this would be the last innocent summer of human history. Because on the horizon, the clouds gathering were not bringing rain. They were bringing steel and fire. When war was declared, nobody wept. On the contrary, they celebrated. The squares were packed. Young men trampled each other to enlist. Why? Because they were sold a lie. They were told it was an adventure, a chance to see the world, impress the girls, and become heroes. The newspapers promised home by Christmas. They thought they would beat the Germans in a week and return with medals on their chests. Boys as young as 17 lied about their age to join the army. None of them knew that the uniform they wore with such pride was actually their shroud. The trains departed, from London, from Paris, from Berlin, wagon loads of excitement, wagon loads of laughter. At first, it felt like a school trip. Cards were played, songs were sung, but as the miles passed, the laughter died down. The cities were left behind. The landscape changed. Green fields were replaced by burnt trees, craters, and a gray sky. The fresh scent of summer was gone, replaced by a different smell. The final stop. They stepped off into France, but it didn't look like Earth. It was colorless, black, gray, and brown. They thought they would be home by Christmas, but when the first rain started and that damn mud seeped into their boots, they understood the reality. The adventure was over. Civilization was over. Welcome to the underground city. The Western Front wasn't a line. It was a scar across the face of Europe. 400 miles of trenches stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. It was a vast, confusing underground city, a labyrinth of mud. There were frontline trenches, support trenches, communication trenches, all built in zigzag patterns. Why? Because if a shell landed inside, the blast would be contained to one section. If the enemy jumped in, they couldn't fire straight down the line. And between your ditch and the German ditch lay no man's land. A moonscape of craters, barbed wire, and unburied dead. To raise your head above the parapet during the day meant instant death by a sniper. But the Germans weren't the only enemy. You shared your bed, your food, and your sanity with a new roommate. The rat. They were everywhere. Not normal rats. These were corpse rats. They grew fat on the dead in no man's land. Some grew as big as cats. They would swarm over sleeping soldiers, gnawing on their equipment. And sometimes, their faces. You couldn't kill them fast enough. One pair of rats could produce 900 offspring in a year. The trenches belonged to them. The humans were just visitors. And then there was the water. It rained constantly. The trenches were dug below the sea level in many places. You didn't walk on Earth. You walked in a freezing sludge of clay and water. This led to a new medical horror: trench foot. Standing in freezing water for days caused your feet to swell and go numb. If untreated, the flesh would turn gangrenous and die. Your toes would simply rot off. But the worst thing was the smell. The smell of stagnant water, chloride of lime, unwashed bodies, and the sickly sweet scent of rotting flesh out in no man's land. It was the smell of death, and you could never escape it. Before 1914, war was still seen as an art. Cavalry charges, bayonets, glory. But the 20th century brought a new god to the battlefield: the machine gun. It changed the math of death. One machine gun crew could wipe out an entire battalion of charging men in minutes. It didn't matter how brave you were. It didn't matter how well you marched. Generals fighting with 19th century tactics sent men running into 20th century weapons. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was an industrial execution, like scything wheat. But the bullet was not the biggest killer. The king of the battlefield was artillery. Soldiers called it drumfire. Not just one explosion, but millions. Day and night, non-stop. At the Battle of Verdun, 60 million shells were fired. That is 6 shells for every square inch of ground. It churned the earth into a moonscape. It buried men alive in their shelters. You couldn't fight it. You couldn't hide from it. You just sat in the dark and prayed the next one wouldn't have your name on it. Then, the shelling stopped. A strange silence fell over the trenches. The wind changed direction, and a yellow-green fog began to drift across no man's land. Chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas. You had seconds to react. If you fumbled with your mask, your lungs would fill with fluid. You would drown on dry land. Mustard gas was the worst. It didn't just kill you. It blistered your skin, blinded your eyes, and burned your throat. It stayed in the mud for days, waiting like a trap. War had lost all its honor. There was no glory in coughing your lungs out in a cloud of poison. Humanity had invented a new way to die. You can heal a bullet wound. You can fix a broken bone. But what happens when the mind itself breaks? Imagine standing next to a jackhammer, non-stop, for 4 days. No sleep, no silence, just the constant rhythmic shaking of the earth. The human brain is not built for industrial warfare. Under that pressure, something snapped. Soldiers started to tremble uncontrollably. They went blind, even though their eyes were fine. They went deaf, even though their ears were perfect. They couldn't walk, they couldn't speak. Today, we call it PTSD. But in 1916, they had a different name for it. Lack of moral fiber, or simply, cowardice. Doctors didn't understand it. Generals hated it. They thought these men were faking it to escape the horror. Tragically, hundreds of shell-shocked soldiers, heroes who had given their sanity for their country, were tied to a post and executed by their own friends. Executed for the crime of being human. If you survived the firing squad, and you survived the hospital, you carried the ghost home with you. It's called the 1,000-yard stare. It's the look of a man who has seen things that cannot be unseen. An unfocused gaze, a detachment from reality. Their bodies left the trenches, but a part of their soul stayed there, in the mud, forever. November 11th, 1918, 10:59 a.m. The guns were still firing. Men were still dying, just minutes before peace. And then, silence. Soldiers wrote that the silence was louder than the explosions. It hurt their ears. The machine had finally stopped. They went home. But home wasn't home anymore. The towns looked the same, the people looked the same. But the soldiers, they were aliens on their own planet. They were the broken faces. Men whose faces had been torn apart by shrapnel, hiding behind tin masks painted to look human. They sat in parks, hiding in the shadows, embarrassed to be alive. They couldn't talk about the mud. They couldn't explain the smell of rotting friends. Civilians celebrated victory, but the soldiers knew the truth. There are no winners in a meat grinder, only survivors. They called it the war to end all wars. What a tragic joke. The peace treaty signed in Versailles didn't end the war. It just pressed the pause button for 20 years. The hate was buried in the mud, waiting to grow again. 9 million soldiers died, 21 million wounded, 4 empires destroyed. And for what? A few lines on a map changed? That's all. We remember them as heroes, but they didn't want to be heroes. They wanted to be fathers. They wanted to be husbands. They wanted to grow old. Instead, they became the lost generation. They walked into the trenches so we could learn a lesson. The question is, did we learn it? If you want to keep the memory of the past alive, subscribe to Epochlight, because history forgotten is history repeated.